For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and culturally. Deep in the abyss of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other-than-human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. I invite you to go with me down the rabbit hole as I seek out the silenced, forgotten, buried, abandoned, and demonized stories and practices of regenerative, egalitarian, place-based cultures. There is still time to reconnect with what we have lost, to restore our broken relationships to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, welcome to the Rewilding podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, the traditional territory of the Multnomah and Clackamas Chinookan people, as well as the Kalapuya, Molalla, Cowlitz, and many other tribal groups whom have lived here, subsisted here, and traveled here to trade and make their living since time immemorial. This podcast is produced in partnership with Rewild Portland, a nonprofit organization, and is made possible through financial support from our patrons on Patreon. Thank you. If you feel inspired by this podcast, please subscribe, share it on social media, and write a review on Apple Podcasts. The best way to keep the podcast going is to become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. Hannes Wingate is an artist, builder, designer, and outdoor survival skills instructor. He was educated at Central St. Martin's College of Art in London. He is known internationally for constructing giant human-sized nests from natural materials found within close range of a build site. He's traveled the world, spending time living with and learning traditional skills from the Sami, Maori, Basque, and Native American cultures. In this conversation, Hannes and I discuss his practice as an artist, looking at how he transforms people's perspectives through his sculptural art and storytelling. We touch on some interweaving philosophies and practices like biomimicry, ancestral skills, and how creativity lends itself to state resistance. In the second half, Hannes debriefs my experience at Boulder Outdoor Survival School. Take a listen. Thank you, Hannes, for coming on to the Rewilding podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I have a funny anecdote that I'll like to kind of share about the sort of the things you do and how I've been connected to some of the stuff that you do, which is that a friend of mine once sent me a message on social media and was like, "Hey, my boyfriend said that they saw you on a plane, like on the like in-flight programming on a plane ride from like Denmark to somewhere else in Europe," and I was like, Nope. And they were like, "No, they totally did. It was your name. You were it." And I was like, "I have no idea what we're talking about." And they're like, "It was some show that with like Diplo. Diplo was like the narrator of something." And I was like, "I don't know." And I was just like, "That's wrong." And then I started thinking more and more about it. And I was like, "Oh shit. Like, I bet it has something to do with Hannes." And it was the thing that, you had designed the Burnside nest here in Portland. And had asked me, Kaylin and you were shooting that video for, I think it was Red Bull, about your artistic project and process and all that stuff. And y'all had been like, "Come down and like talk to the camera, be interviewed." And so I went down there, and I was like, because I know what filmmakers or documentary people are looking for or whatever in terms of like sound bites, and I knew your project and you well. I just like talked at them for like 20 minutes, knowing that, they'd get, even if it was a 10-second audio clip, that they would get something from it. And of course they did. And anyway, they put it on the show, which apparently was airing, on in-flight, flight somewhere in Europe. So anyway, it's just a funny thing of, this sort of interesting connection to the wider world of and your art practice and how it's sort of known and talked about in this sort of grander sort of scheme. And it was cool to sort of have that come back from this other perspective,
Yeah, I think, I mean, I love this anecdote, partly because it shows, it actually speaks to what art is and the power of art in a really direct way. because it's like art is really just stories. An artist is a storyteller. You speak, but you interpret the world, and then you tell a story about it through sculpture or through printmaking or through photography or whatever your chosen medium is. And it's very satisfying when the story has unfolded and traveled in that kind of way, when it's traveled
Totally.
far and it comes back to the people that were involved in it, sometimes much, much later. I think we're creatures of story, human beings. Human beings are governed by stories, right? We're guided by stories, and what we have created in terms of culture and institutions are all governed by stories. And so this kind of goes to the heart of it. I love hearing anecdotes like this. I had no idea that show, was a documentary series about contemporary artists and their process. And I was one of multiple artists chosen. I had no idea that show was going to be rolled out worldwide in that way. And I've had multiple people get back to me and say, I was flying to Hong Kong and there you were on the screen.
That's amazing. So yeah,
So,
how did you get into, when and why and how did you get into sculpting and weaving? And why don't you talk a little bit about your projects and your practice?
yeah, so I never really chose to be. I never thought I'm going to be an artist, or I'm going to be a sculptor. But I did choose. I did choose to allow myself to continue to search, to follow my curiosity and create a path that would allow me to continue to learn and investigate things that I was interested in. So I these sculptures that we're talking about in particular, they are large scale woven nests that are created adapting a set of rules that mimic how the bird works. So I forage for materials within a certain radius. I weave them together without the use of fasteners. There's no screws, nails, wire, glue. There's no construction materials. And I limit myself to simple hand tools like a knife and an axe. But the whole project really started as an investigation into the nesting process of birds as a creative strategy. Like, how do we, how does the bird do it, and what values govern how the bird does it? And if you build in that way, what kind of outcome do you create? What kind of experience do you create? And then if I do that, if I adopt those rules, what kind of experience do I create, and how does that impact people? So I was really fascinated by how the bird, and this was kind of the nucleus of the investigation, really, because I was fascinated by how the bird would take the valueless, the flimsy, the discarded, the ubiquitous, and it would invest time and know-how with a very clear intention. And it would fuse those materials into something that was really beautiful often, and very, perfectly functional and perfectly utilitarian, specific to that species. And then once that nest was used, it had the ability to recede seamlessly into the environment that it came from. So it's like the ultimate ecological cradle to cradle principle. And it's the ultimate manifestation of creativity, and that you make something out of nothing. And that something is beautiful and functional, but it has zero impact on the environment. And more importantly, maybe at this time, for this era, this time in history, is like the bird creates something that is valuable for it. It doesn't care, the bird doesn't care about what the deer thinks,
Right.
or what the badger thinks. It's not designed to impress anybody else. And so it is an expression of the individual's values and the individual's place in the ecosystem. As human beings in a consumer economy, like we're really, really concerned about what other people are thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so our consumption pattern, the values that we have adopted and our patterns of consumption are governed by a completely different set of values that what governs the birds. And that is part of the dynamic that lies at the heart of the ecological crisis. So the bird nests then, they're fun, magical structures, right? They conjure up, powerful childhood fantasies about tree houses, and they're sacred spaces, and they kind of break open people's idea of reality and create a whole set of, they create a powerful experience and a powerful moments with possibilities in them. But fundamentally, they're symbols of like reclaiming our own values and reclaiming our own place, a rightful place in the ecosystem.
Yeah, you're making me think of all kinds of cool things too, because so the sculptures that you make are so large, people sit inside them, right? Like people climb inside. They're like meant for people. It makes me think about, and I've been in multiple sculptures of yours, nests, and I think I haven't really thought about this until just sort of you explaining this aspect of the bird thing. But they don't feel like like I've built quote unquote primitive shelters, or like when I look at like Iron Age roundhouses, or even though those are all made out of natural materials, there's still like a different vibe to some of these structures that I've been in than sort of the organic, almost like unhuman or like non-human nests that you've built.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Just,
it feels like and it's making me realize that the nests themselves like sort of have this more I don't know if magical is the right word, but like magical feeling to be in them that makes me think of like, the psychology of being in quote unquote man-made environments, right? Like you walk through a cityscape, you're on like a grid with concrete and squared buildings and stuff like that. And
yeah.
even when we like leave that and start making our own shelters and stuff from natural materials, and maybe they're, like I watch Alone, for example, and there's lots of cool shelters being made on those shows all the time, and I love that, and they look beautiful and stuff. But there's still this like ethereal magic that is more present in your sculptural pieces than in these sort of like utilitarian squared houses made out of sticks, or even if they're just like
Yeah.
natural materials, there's still like a totally different feeling
Yeah.
behind
Yeah.
that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, I have, I spent my childhood in this very alternative village in Sweden. And so, I have built hundreds and hundreds of primitive shelters of all kinds, right? And I've taught people how to do this. I think that and I think this came about organically. It isn't something that I kind of thought through clearly in my mind when I started making, but a lot of the time in kind of in good creative process, you work yourself up to a certain point, through your research and through your your technique and practice, etc. But then you jump off the edge onto the deep end, and then the work makes itself. It's an intuitive, very intense, and quite often sort of spiritual process. And I felt intuitively that these nests, they needed to be pushed technically and aesthetically, they needed to be pushed really far out to an edge. And part of that pushing has to do with adopting these rules. That if I walk into a wild place and I'm going to build a structure that is 10 feet in diameter, but in that place there's no great materials to weave with necessarily, so I have to adapt my technique. So that's one of the dynamics that starts to create a look and a feel that is outside of what is recognizably human. But I think it's a really critical quality. Human places and human structures and human materials, they all tell a story, and that story is recognizable to us whether we can tune into it, on a conscious or intellectual level or not. And part of what's communicated through these buildings, and even if they're primitive, is it taps into, there's long tendrils that go into human history, long tendrils that go into the, you know, the stories that are attached to that human history and those timeframes and those objectives and so on. So part of the objective of my sculpture is to create the possibility of there being a different way of thinking, you know, the possibility of there being a different kind of future and the possibility of there being a different kind of story altogether. So then the work has to be pushed outside of what is recognizable. It has to detach itself from these familiar stories and the familiar materials. And I've always, and this also, you know, this conclusions grew organically with the work, that I always feel like that it has to have this WTF factor. Because if it does, then it creates a crack in reality, in the consensus reality, and then a crack. There's a whole set of suite of possibilities. You know, so if people are going about, oh yeah, we're going to go and see the sculpture, but when they approach it, they're like, Jesus Christ, like,
yeah,
what the fuck is this? You know, then you win. You know, I don't win personally, but you know, creativity wins over reality.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that's like an edge. There's possibilities on that, in that edge, that we desperately need as a culture.
Yeah. Yeah, it also makes me think, there's a book by Tim Ingold called Making, and he talks about, well, one of the essays in there is about the Acheulean hand axe, which is like, you know, one of the first, it's the second or third now stone tool industry, but it started like, you know, a million to you know, 1.5 million years ago, whatever, right? And then it stayed the same on three different continents for like a million years. And he harkens, or you know, he likens this sort of technology to the technology of the bird nest in this essay, where you know, you can look at a nest of like a robin's nest anywhere in the United States, and it's like, that's a robin's nest. How do they all build the same nest? Are they doing it intuitively? You know, are they all do they all just think the same way or feel the same sort of feelings that allow them to construct these things in the same way? And you know, there's a lot of thought around design and cognition, and the two being linked together in terms of prehistory. Like there was this idea for a long time that humans had the idea of the hand axe completed shape in their mind before they started working the stone. And he has this theory, but like, he's like, how is it that it looks the same on three different continents for a million years, just like a bird nest looks the same? He's like, maybe they didn't have the design in mind. Maybe they just felt their way through the stone, and they all ended up in the same way, in the same shape or relative same shape, and that it wasn't like a cognitive thing per se. And I just really love that. It makes me think about you talking about, you know, doing this research and then sort of just jumping off into the deep end or whatever, to like actually do the things, and sort of like maybe potentially feeling your way through the process. It also makes me think of, you know, the potential for this sort of deeper tree nest that, you know, I mean, if you look at chimpanzees and gorillas and potentially the australopiths, like maybe we were actually constructing these types of nests up in the trees. So maybe you're also tapping into, you know, this other thing. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no question. I think, you know, in it, and I love this sort of indigenous perspective on human beings that, you know, exists in many cultures, but the indigenous perspective is that, you know, we're the young ones as a species. You know, that there's an awareness within, you know, cultures that are tens of thousands of years old in many cases, but there's an awareness about a much deeper history in which human beings are relative newcomers onto the scene compared to the red fox and the grizzly bear and the robin. And there's an awareness also that we learn the things that we know from our brothers and sisters, the animals. And so, you know, fiber arts, broadly speaking, which is in our culture anything from basketry to tensile structures to fabrics to cordage and so on, it all came from the birds.
Totally.
You know, they taught us how to do it. And you mentioned the Bronze Age, you know, Bronze Age, you know, roundhouse. that's a basket turned upside down,
Mm-hmm.
clad with reeds,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes it has a lower wall with that's wattle and daub, so woven hazel saplings plastered with mud. So all of those techniques that are there, they came directly from the birds, including the wattle and daub,
Mm-hmm.
which is essentially the blueprint for reinforced concrete.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go back far enough, there's swallows' nests and other birds' nests that use mud reinforced with twigs or fiber like horsehair. And so, we have a tendency as a species to credit ourselves. We pat ourselves on the back with our genius. but so much of what we know, uh, the animals taught us. And I think the reason why things look the same, like this axe looks the same on 3 continents for a million years, is that we intuitively found our way to the shape because that's what we needed, and that's what worked. Totally. If stuff doesn't work, in an indigenous culture, if stuff doesn't work, you're not going to live. So the sort of the repository of indigenous knowledge is incredibly powerful and valuable, right?
Yeah, awesome.
And I always love and I think this comes probably, I heard it from Bruce Mao anyway. He's a Canadian designer of some renown, but the design is the human capacity to produce desired outcomes. And so, traditionally, as a species, we're all designers.
Yeah.
So human culture and design and art or creativity is deeply intertwined. They're totally inseparable.
Yeah, it's weird that we even separate them, but our culture's the contemporary modern society is built on abstraction, I guess. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting suite of questions that comes out of that particular observation. I think, creativity is an unruly force. It's an uncolonized territory, which the power is uncomfortable about, and it always has been.
Mm-hmm.
And so creativity then has been relegated into specific professions, into specific types of activities, and it's been brought in through education in that way. And it's also treated culturally, socially, with a certain level of restraint and disdain, prejudice.
Totally.
But we are going through a bit of a change there because the economy is realizing that there's no more places to colonize, there's fewer and fewer places to find and extract from, where we can't enslave people anymore. So creativity then becomes this well of possibility for generating capital, and so creativity's role in society is being reappraised in that way. That's one of the ways in which it's being reappraised.
Yeah, interesting. Huh. So yeah, how did you get into, ancestral skills and bushcraft? Were you into that? I mean, you said, you grew up in Sweden, obviously on land and doing some of that stuff, but did you have, as an adult, were you like into those skills before you found your art practice, or did your art practice kind of emerge from your interest in ancestral skills?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I, so I grew up in this back to the land hippie village, right? And I had 100% freedom under responsibility as a child. I had very supportive parents who were very hands off. So I roamed freely outside, endlessly. And I also grew up in a country, in a culture where a lot of what's considered there were a lot of traditional skills around.
Totally.
Woodworking, working with knives, foraging, all different seasonal traditions, and there was a lot of old timers around that knew a lot of stuff, and I didn't think that this was anything unusual growing up, obviously. Just totally kind of integrated. And I then, after I graduated from high school, I worked for a few years in creative fields, and then ended up going to this radical experimental art and design degree at a school in London. And my explicit purpose to go to school was I wanted to create kind of a cushion of time in which I could really dig into, like, what am I drawn to, what am I interested in, and what are the questions, and kind of like what are that are kind of pulling me in, and what's the correlation between these, like where do they lead to, and what kept them coming up was just me being ruled by my upbringing, my kind of deep unmediated experience on the land. It kept sort of defining what I was drawn to and what the questions that came up, and it's out of that this some of these central questions that we talked about when talking about the nest specifically, that they started coming up. Who are we as a species? What do we need? What how do we get from where we were to where we are now? And then I started working then more specifically, more intently with traditional skills and traditional materials, within my creative practice in a way that I hadn't done before. And that's where the kind of nest project was just one of those kind of threads. And as I, my final project on this degree, I built a 15-foot tall by 12-foot wide woven nest illegally at night inside the financial district in London. Which at the time was one of the most video surveyed territories in the world because of the IRA bombing campaign in the 90s. And it was the most expensive real estate in Europe. It would be like building an illegal giant bird nest just off Wall Street today. So it was kind of none of my tutors dared to go there because they were so afraid of being arrested. Oh. And so I graduated in the top percent of the school.
Were there any repercussions from that?
Well, it was nervy as hell building it. I had to parkour my way into the site and have all these camouflage strategies and use a lot of stealth. And on the final night that I was working there, I was discovered by the cops. But I could see them at a distance where they were kind of massing. They were kind of they spotted me, and then they were kind of gathering a group of policemen to intervene. But it gave me enough time to get out of there. So I expected I was going to be arrested and the whole thing was going to be shut down, and that would become part of the project.
Totally, then. Yes.
But I somehow managed to skate through.
Wow, that's amazing. Do you have photographs of it, or is there any
Oh yeah. I had to document it really carefully.
Totally.
I couldn't go to my teachers and say, I built this really cool thing, but I was arrested and it's gone.
It's gone. Sorry. Yeah, dog ate my homework kind of thing. Yeah, that's amazing.
But going back to your original question, I started digging into primitive skills more intently then through this, and then after I graduated and through my work, I continued to follow these threads, and feeling instinctively that there was something very important in these skills. There was something very important in this knowledge. There was something very important to learn about us, as human beings through these subjects, through these skills. And those have been some of the guiding questions, and that's ultimately what led me to BOSS. To this survival school. And I came there as a student thinking that I didn't really know anything, thinking that I've arrived at this place that's totally going to school me now. And it did, but not in the way that I thought. But I realized then, because coming there as a student was a proper engagement with a very an environment where the level of competency was very high.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I suddenly realized that I actually know a lot of this stuff, and a lot of it came from my childhood, and there were things I didn't even consider knowledge or
Totally.
skills.
Yep.
And they just started kind of emerging when I was there. I was like, oh, I actually know something about this that is not common knowledge.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a million ancestral skills, not a million, but there's a lot of ancestral skills, organizations and businesses and things like all over the world. What
yeah,
specifically drew you to Boulder Outdoor Survival School?
I just, I came across, and I dug this up actually recently, the small print ad. I think I found it in 2000. I had come over to the States from London to visit my girlfriend at the time, and I found this print ad, and then I read it a little bit about the school, and it really appealed to me. This Boss has a 28-day field course that they've been running since the school's inception in the late 60s. It's a 28-day course that is physically and mentally very challenging. It's in the field from day one. You come out on the last day. And there's something that appealed to me about this like pretty hardcore physical, practical immersion. It's very no nonsense. Like you're
Totally.
there, you're doing it, and then you're really pushing your boundaries. And so much of knowledge, there's a lot of knowledge transfer. There's a lot of that happens by osmosis in those experiences. So much about how this subject is taught is like a workshop. You sit inside, you talk through the theory, and you practice, and you take a break and have lunch, and you go
Yeah.
back and you work on it again. And it's like, yeah, sure, you learn it that way, but you don't ever get the field testing. It's never internalized, right? And it's
Totally.
also and you also never, or very seldomly, do you have to depend on it, which is really where it gets internalized.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I did Lynx's Stone Age immersion in 2012, I used this example as sort of the pinnacle of that experience was, we had spent 3 months camping on property, making all of our own stone tools and baskets and, sewing all our own buckskin clothes, tanning all the hides to make those. Like everything was, handmade from natural materials. And,
Mm-hmm.
I've done all that. I've done most of that stuff before, but like the field testing part of it was what I was most interested in. And so, like, on
Mm-hmm.
our first night out, to the actual project part of it, we left in the middle of the night under under the cover of nightfall, because for many reasons. One was to avoid any sort of government people seeing us leave the town, because Lynx had had some history with them, um, and so we left under the
Such a
cover
good
of.
quality.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a
So
great
we,
quality of the experience.
so yeah, I mean, it added to the whole thing, right? Yeah, like we're leaving under the cover of nightfall. So, but my sandals fell apart on the hike in. And they were really terrible sandals to begin with. I should have never worn them. But again, there's like, how do you know? How do I make stuff all the time with natural materials. How do I know if it's actually viable, right? So we were like walking out, my sandals fell apart, and I had to fix them under the moonlight with a bone awl. And as I was fixing it, I just got this like shit-eating grin on my face. And I was just like, this is the whole reason I'm here. Like
Yeah,
everything that we've been doing is built to this moment where I'm actually using these things in a
totally,
context of survival or necessity, to
totally,
make sure that they're working properly for me, and my body and
yeah,
all the things. And um, yeah, it was an
totally. I mean,
interesting thing.
it's such a good example, this that you share, this particular moment, because I think it's like there's like, you have an objective, you've got to get there. Is your footwear, you don't have any light source, you have to repair it. You should have prepared better, and now you've learned the lesson in the field, and there's the rest of the group waiting for you, like, oh, when is it going to get done? Why didn't you do a sandals? It's like there's
Yeah,
all these threads that come together
totally.
that
Yes.
you're not going to get in the abstraction of
Yes.
sitting in a classroom.
Exactly.
So
It's funny because at Boss so I did the 14-day, and on the very first night, as we were cresting over one of the Navajo sandstones, I saw the contrast of a white sun-bleached bone sitting on the rock. And of course, I love making bone tools or whatever. So, and it was a it was a metacarpal. It was a shattered one. It looked pretty weathered. I wasn't sure if it would work for anything, but I grabbed it.
mhm,
Metacarpals are
mhm,
great. And then the next day during the siesta, I just found a good sandstone rock, sanded it into an awl, put it in my pocket. I thought, this is cool. I made a bone awl. I don't
mhm,
think I'll ever use this for anything, but who knows? On this trip, because it was mostly modern slash natural gear that we were using, for that. But one of the things that we were doing every day was like tying up our blanket packs and
mhm.
using paracord to do that. And oftentimes we were tying it really tight to make sure that the backpack was super snug. But then it's really
Yeah,
hard to get your fingers and fingernails in there to untie those cords. And so, of course, I had my bone awl, and so I ended up, sharing the bone awl around. And it's sort of like it's funny that they're both of those experiences, had a bone awl in them, and different purposes. But again, field testing, doing a thing where I'm in the field, and then all of a sudden I'm actually using these materials to do something that's actually super helpful.
totally. Yeah, and I think what I love that you sharing that extension of the story there, because I think it's like it demonstrates a quality that you can only learn in the field, and that is the kind of opportunism. Right? I think as a species, I think we are kind of perceptive, creative. We're very versatile, extremely robust, right, and extremely adaptable. And I think one of the qualities of a survivor, right, is this opportunism of like, what am I finding here? What could this be good for? How can I use this? And so like you see the bone, you're like, aha, I can do something with this, and then you take a break later and you fabricate it, not because you have a class in fabricating tools, but because you have a moment to do it.
Yeah,
You're keeping your hands busy.
yeah,
So there's a possibility, and then you work on it, and then it finds utility later on. That the challenge for a lot of students that come to Boss is this, they don't understand the utility and the continuity and the opportunism. They want to be tested, and they want to walk through the challenge, but they're expecting the instructors to say, now we're going to have this in this lesson, and you're going to make this, and now we're going to forage for this. And it's like, yeah, that happens, but it's totally up to you to tie it all together. It's totally
totally.
up to you to become the survivor. It's totally up to you to become effective,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
through the kind of experience that you describe.
So, um, I guess I'm curious, how long have you been sort of, you've been teaching there off and on for a while. How did you end up, so you had an experience there. You did the 28-day, and then,
Yeah.
what did you do from there? How did you get more involved?
But the school, I went there in 2007. The school has mm, only recruits from its alumni. So after every course, the longer field courses, the 14 and 28 field course, sometimes other courses too, but the instructor team will sit down and say, did we have a student here that we liked, and that was sort of has the right stuff to come back and join the apprentice program. And so I was contacted by the school uh, maybe 6 months or so after I finished the program, and they asked if I wanted to come back. And my initial response was like, hell no. I grew up in the I grew up in the boreal forests, so the desert is a really foreign environment to me. And I had a really challenging course, not physically or skill level, but it was so the social
Totally.
element of it was
Yes.
challenging, right? You're in
Yes.
the desert for 28 days with 12 random people. It was all men. There were few people that were really solid and competent, and we had a bunch of people that were you know dangerously incompetent and difficult to deal with, just because they were needed a lot of help,
Mm-hmm.
which I wasn't mature enough to kind of like see, or I saw it, but I wasn't mature enough to kind of like see my responsibility clearly and to
Totally.
step into that role.
Yeah.
Anyways, but I sat with it for a little bit, and then I realized I'd be a fool if I didn't go back. Here's this rarefied
Yeah,
environment with
yeah.
like, 150 years of accumulated field time,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
super passionate people. There's no school like this in the United States and not in the world. And so I just realized I'd be a total idiot if I didn't go back and just engage with this environment and learn
Mm-hmm.
from it. And so that's how I started.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, so you were one of the main reasons why I started going or why I went. I mean Alex, my first ancestral skills mentor as a teen, he was an apprentice there in the 90s. I've been wanting to go since then.
Mhm.
But it's just one of those things where it's a commitment,
Yeah,
both
it is.
financially and time wise, right? And traveling and all the things that are required of it. And so it's been on my bucket list, but I think if it weren't for your encouragement, I probably wouldn't have ended up going.
Mhm.
And what's funny is, initially I wanted to do, per your suggestion, just go to the hunter gatherer course, and
Mhm.
kind of skip the 28 day and 14 or 14 day. Um, but when I contacted them, the hunter gatherer course was full already. It's a pretty popular one. They only do it like once a year, so it fills pretty quick.
Yeah.
And then I thought, you know what? Why not just do one of the 14 day? I don't have time for the 28 day. That's too much of a commitment for me, in terms of my livelihood and everything. But the 14 days seemed like a fun way to, introduce myself to boss, basically, right? Like,
Mhm.
what is the classic elements of this organization, and kind of put myself through as a beginner, and I really, you said that I had skills that to just jump into the hunter gatherer, but because I was uncertain,
Yeah.
it's always nice to kind of and also, I think the skills that I thought I was lacking were the physicality of the experience, like being fit enough to and psychologically fortified enough for things like hunger and being cold and the discomfort levels, right?
Mhm.
I thought I wasn't necessarily psychologically fit for that. And so I thought it would be just a good introduction to go through that, um,
Mhm.
and I'm actually really glad that I did, even though you were totally right in your assessment. I basically have, I mean, I could have taught the majority of the program, but not necessarily the way and the flow and structure that they had, right? So it was cool to sort of go through it and see that the skills classes are I mean, like bow drill, for example, I have been teaching that for like 25 years. So
Yeah.
but a different environment, different teachers teach things differently. So when I go to things as a student, I'm also going there as like a teacher that's becoming a student to learn how to teach or see how other teachers are teaching to improve my ability to teach. Um,
Yeah.
so my concern in that sense was like, oh, I hope I'm not like derailing their lessons by doing things early, or and I don't want to look like I'm showing off because I can do this. Like there's all this kind of stuff going on in my head in the background.
I haven't heard any negative feedback from your
Oh,
participation, so
that's
I think
great.
you're good. I think you're good.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean the instructors were amazing. That was, I think that was part of my enjoyment of the whole thing, was just the how the instructors actually really blew me away. So like, a lot of the preconceived notions that I had of the school from the 90s were, this sort of contrast between like the Tom Brown Jr. pedagogy or school and Boulder Outdoor Survival School. And the sort of
Yeah.
irony of like the pot calling the kettle black, I think, where, the tracker school people would often like say things about boss in terms of that it being sort of like this hyper masculine, man against nature kind of thing. Um,
Yeah.
when actually
Yeah.
the tracker school itself does a lot of that, right? It's just it was just very weird. It was sort of like this. Anyway, so I was blown away by like the humility and sensitivity among the leadership at
Mhm.
Boss. And I mean, the thing is, I've met multiple people that teach there over the years, and all of them seemed really cool. I
Yeah.
was sad when I found out that some of my favorite folks that work there weren't going to be my instructors, but at the same time, I was like, well, great, this will give me an opportunity to connect with even more people at the school and see an even bigger picture. And it was just like the bigger picture just continued to make me have more and more respect for the community that they've built there in terms of their um, just their like I don't know, humility and grace with respect to being in that place, like ecologically, as teachers, as people, socially. It was just a really great experience, and I have so
I'm so
much
glad.
respect for all the teachers. Yeah.
I'm so glad. I mean, for me to recommend you to go, um, I mean, that's easy, right? But I think, you have a tremendous amount of experience, um, you know, practically, technically, intellectually, academically, across the board. You've engaged with so much of this subject over such a long time. But what I felt might be in it for you is that um, it is in this sort of transition from into the field. Um,
Yes,
take all this knowledge and then allow yourself this space of time where
exactly.
you're living off the land. You can practice your skills, and you can
Yes.
see it in action, see yourself in action, in this environment, with fellow teachers, right, who are very dedicated. um, what were some of the things that surprised you the most?
Um, in terms of, uh my own learning and sort of, I was surprised that I was physically super competent. I was joking with the rest of the students the whole time that the hardest thing I did there physically was the mile and a half run right when we get there. Because they want to
Yeah,
see how your body responds to stress, so you jog a mile and a half. And that was like the
yeah,
hardest thing physically for me, where I thought I was going to be, you know, really experiencing a lot of physical challenges while I was there. I mean, that was a huge reason also why I went, because I'm very interested in pushing my body and seeing what my limitations are physically, especially with
mhm,
just, multiple health problems that I have physically and stuff like that. It's interesting to try to see where those physical challenges can be overcome in an environment like that, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah.
field testing my hemorrhoids, for example, or field testing IBS. What I mean? Like,
That's
how
hilarious.
do I deal with these things, right? I mean, it was a huge.
That's
I'm
a
super interested.
that's a podcast in its own right.
Yes, well, I came up with my little journal, Peter's backcountry bidet steps or whatever, step by step guide to
Mhm.
going to the bathroom, blah blah blah. Anyway, that is a whole other podcast. But no,
There's
I was
a there. I just have to, there are some instructors that are actually teaching you how to do a backcountry bidet, which I think is, hygienically, from a
yes.
hygienic standpoint, it makes 100% sense.
Totally. Yes. So, yeah, it was like the physical parts were actually some of the easiest stuff. Once,
Yeah,
we had been going hungry for a couple of days without eating. When they first gave us food, I was kind of like, really? Like, like
good way.
I could go at least another day, and it's funny because like earlier in the day I was like, well, on the very first day, they're like talking about, the alert system, right? So you hoot once as like a companion call, like hooting
Mhm.
is sort of like the communication, right? So you're like, hoo, hoo. And that's
Yeah,
considered a one thing. And if you hear that, you hoot back, hoo, hoo, right? And then the two hoots, hoo, hoo, is like, come here, right? So it's
yeah,
like, we need to meet up. And then the three hoots is like, don't do that unless it's a life threat emergency. So that's like 911, which a life threat is like, the ABCs. Are you bleeding to death? Are you suffocating? Those things.
yeah,
And they were like, it's not something like, you've been vomiting, something that's normal, like you've been vomiting up green foam because you haven't eaten anything in days or something.
yeah.
And then, or this thing or that thing. And they just kind of like breezed past saying this thing about vomiting up green foam being normal. And I was like, in the back of my head, I'm like, shit, is that a normal thing? That's so fucking awesome and weird. Like, is that going to happen to me?
Yeah.
So then, like days later, I'm like, where it's a siesta, we're all hanging out, and I'm telling a story to them. I don't remember what it was. I was just like in the middle of a story when all of a sudden, just like this wave of nausea came over me, and I was like, uh I'm sorry, like I think I might throw up. And everybody was like, oh really? And nobody had thrown up. And I was like, wow,
Mhm.
yeah, I think I might actually throw up. And in the back of my head I'm thinking, I want to throw up. Like, am I gonna throw up green foam? This is gonna be awesome. This is gonna be so weird. It'll be such a good story or whatever. You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
the waves of nausea kind of came and went that first day, or the not the first day, the third day. But by the end of the day, we were like eating a little bit here to sort of reintegrate and hydration salts and stuff like that. But it was just funny because by the end I was like, oh man, I never threw up green foam or whatever. I mean, I just like anyway. So it was cool actually to see. That was actually one of the things I was surprised that I was able to handle the physical discomforts of the 14-day field course with ease, relative ease.
Yeah.
So that was cool. Especially,
Yeah.
going into it fearing what was going to happen to my body and wondering, about all my physical ailments and how they might come out and make the experience really challenging, or even like would it ruin it? Would I need to be
Yeah.
evacuated? I don't know. All these different things were
Yeah.
were popping in my head.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, it's a really good suite of reflections. I think that you put forward, because I think culturally through media, this survival subject is full of sort of imagery of this like prime physical specimen survival dude, you know, trained by the military. He's superior to all of us, and he's powerful enough and knows all the tricks to beat nature and come back alive. And that sort of like that creates this image that this is what survival is, and this is how you have to do it. And if you're not like that, you're probably not going to make it.
right,
But that's bullshit.
right,
It's bullshit, because for hundreds of thousands of years, every member of society, from the oldest to the youngest, have lived.
right,
Right? Not everybody lived, but enough people lived for the culture to survive. In the case of the Bushmen, for 100,000 years in the same place, which is like radical success. And so, what really is the challenge at a place like Boss, and why Boss is so amazing. What really is the challenge, because you put together that the fear, am I going to be good enough, the fear of the unknown, with environmental duress, and then dehydration and hunger, and then you know uh, your particular physical profile. um, and all of that comes together to be really, really challenging for everybody at one point or another. um, and the beauty of Boston is that there's almost no places where you can go and do this. There's always no places where you can
totally,
go
yeah,
to be challenged like this,
yeah,
unless you orchestrate it yourself, or unless
right,
you go to the military or something like that.
right. But I
And
mean,
and ironically, not everybody, not very many people get this in the military either.
right, exactly, yeah,
It's
yeah.
sort of relegated to special units and so on.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, and that was the other thing, when I interviewed Eli, who's the executive director right now, that was one of the things that I said to him was that, you know, um, one of the reasons why I wanted to do it was because it's such a safety net, right? Like, that they've been
Yeah,
doing this for like 60, almost 60 years or whatever, and that they're, it's a safe place to test yourself in this particular way, or not necessarily test, but to find yourself, to find how you fit in, or to find the habits, the patterns, the
yeah,
routines that you can do that work with your body in these environments. It's just,
yeah, totally.
and you could set this up yourself, but would it be on par with that? I don't think so. I mean, I think it would be really challenging to set yourself up to do something like that and have it be as safe, as Boss in that sense, because of the amount of like infrastructure that's in the background. I mean, it was very clear that there was a lot going on in the background that we were not seeing, everything from
Yeah,
like gear drops to water, like just the mapping, the where we were going. Like, there was so much
yeah,
location knowledge and
yeah,
scouting and all the stuff that had to have happened before and during.
Yeah.
the program that it was just like, wow, no wonder this is expensive. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not expensive for everybody, but but it is. There's a reason why it has the the price that it does, and that's because of the extensive safety measures and research and planning and everything that goes into it, and the
Yeah.
the backup teams that are invisible, you don't even see, right? So I mean, I know who my three instructors were, but how many other people were there in the background that we didn't
Yeah.
know were there? At one point, like one of the people in my group had to be not evacuated for medical reasons, but they had a family member pass away, and
Hmm.
they they just disappeared, and then they said their goodbyes. But it was clear that there was like a backup team that they had radioed into the instructors that were then on the road somewhere nearby, to take them out of
Yeah.
the program. And it was just cool to kind of be like, okay, even though like visually we feel like we're in the middle of nowhere and there's no real contact with the outside world, like there are invisible threads that are making this experience safer in that regard. Even if there's a sort of illusion or pretend illusion that we're completely away from everything. I mean, it's just impossible to get really that far away from a road, anywhere in the United States, at
Yeah.
least. Um,
The safeguarding the integrity of the experience for the students is paramount. It's paramount for the experience, the effectiveness of the experience itself. It's and but Boss has spent this like 6 decades almost, right, perfecting this field recipe in which we bring students in, strip them down, uh, not naked, but we take
unless they
we
want to in their own time on their solo.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's very specific moments where this is allowed. No, but you strip them down of their normal gear, and expectations, and you strip away the ordinary reality, and then we hike deep. We go deep into the field, um, physically and psychospiritually.
Totally.
And Boss then takes people into the red zone, um, where you feel like your life is on the
Oh
line.
yeah.
You feel like death is lurking. I mean, that sounds very dramatic, right? But it's like you get to test your edges, and you get to exceed your edges, and you get to define where edges are that you didn't think were going to be there. And there are very, very few places where you can do this, and there is a well-oiled and very refined uh, organization behind allowing that to actually unfold in a safe way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's often said that if we wanted to start Boss from scratch today, we'd never get it off the ground,
Yeah.
because the assessment of risk would be considered kind of legally untenable, and I think there's truth to that. But Boss exists because of its extraordinary track record, um,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
of its relationships with the different parties that make it possible to
Totally.
do it.
Yeah, I think, the hardest part for me out there, in terms of what I was surprised at, I wasn't surprised because I know myself pretty well in this sense, but I knew that the solo was going to be challenging for me.
Hmm.
And even though it was only 48 hours, I did a vision quest when I was 21 that was supposed to be 4 days and 4 nights, and there's a whole bunch of other backstory around that makes it not as great as and an experience as I would have liked. But it was sort of in the tracker school community, it was kind of like for tracker school students, and there was very much strong emphasis on the notions of like good and evil, which are totally like Judeo-Christian concepts. Most
Yeah,
cultures don't have the same
it's
sense
just
of good and evil. Um,
it's really unhelpful, frankly.
Yeah, I agree. So, I lasted, and there was a lot to be learned from that vision quest anyway, but I came down after a day and a half from that experience, and left and went home immediately, even though they were like, you can just hang out here in the camp for a couple of days until everybody else comes out. I was like, no, I'm getting the fuck out of here. And And so I've had this sort of sense, so going into the solo, I was like, this is going to be cool because this is not exactly a vision quest. I'm not going to think of it in the same way exactly, but it's an opportunity to kind of test myself against this notion that I have a hard time being alone for long periods of time in this
Mhm.
context. Like I could sit at home alone for weeks or months or whatever, right? If I've got TV or the internet or whatever, like but to be, in the wilderness away from any culture, by myself, away from any people, that's a whole other context, right? Of
Yeah,
aloneness. Um,
totally.
so,
Yes.
and it was definitely the most challenging thing for me. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
It's funny because I have like a negativity bias. So the longer I'm sort of by myself, the more my thoughts will spiral into, um, you know, just negative things. And I even though I try to put a positive spin on them, like perhaps I think, coming out, I'm like, maybe I should do some cognitive behavioral therapy. I think that might help if I can come up if I can get some better tools for being alone, from something like that. Um but that was definitely the most challenging thing for me. And it's funny because we came out of that, and we're doing like a debrief, and everybody is like, it was so great to be alone. Like I don't normally get this much time by myself to think about things, and I was just like having all these insights and blah blah blah. And they're like, Peter, what was your experience? And I was like, I fucking hated it. I was bored as shit. I was going out of my mind. I just was like spiraling on, like, it's, like, I didn't need to process anything, but like old shit that I've already processed is coming up, and instead of like processing it, I'm just like, now I'm putting a negative spin on it, even though I feel like I've already gone through. It's just like this is bad for my brain. Like I have a really hard time with this. And there's just sort of like dead silence.
No, nobody had anything
Everybody's
good
like,
good to say to help you on your way.
okay. Well, all right. Anyway, what next person? What was your experience? It's super funny. Um, so yeah, and,
Well,
and
you
but so the whole thing, I was like, I could easily do the 28-day course, right? Like everything that I did there, I was like, this would be easy, except then I think about the fact that on the 28-day course, they were like, you might be out on your solo for like 4 or 5 days, and yours was even
yeah,
longer, right?
yeah, I think I did 6 days, 5 nights.
Jeez.
I thought it was amazing. I mean,
Yeah, right.
it's totally amazing. I think, I mean, it reveals a lot about a person, and not from a kind of like othering or judgmental
Totally,
place. It
totally.
reveals a lot about yourself, about
Yeah,
um, and I think, I mean, I know that you and I touched base on this briefly before, but I think it's, you may be there with your negativity bias, but one of the things it shows you so clearly is how much you love people,
hmm,
and how connected you are and how valuable those
totally.
connections are to you. And I think that isn't anything negative at all. The worst punishment in you a lot of indigenous societies was being ostracized,
Right.
basically banished from the tribe. And it was worse than death, because you knew that if you were ostracized, you were going to be alone, and you would lose your entire identity because your identity is intertwined with
Mm,
the people.
mm,
And then you would, uh, lose your mind, because over time, right? And you also die a slow death, because no one can survive long term
right.
just by
Yeah,
themselves.
yeah,
It's a foreign and abhorrent
yeah.
concept. Even though we worship the idea of the rugged individual and the lone wolf, that too is bullshit
Totally.
culturally,
Yeah,
historically.
yeah.
Um, but so I think, there's probably a lot of gold in there for you,
Absolutely.
to work with.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Yes.
um,
Yeah, I mean, even
I mean,
the vision quest in my 20s, or my early 20s, like even that, even though that I felt like a failure in that experience specifically, I didn't feel like a failure in this one because of like the things you're saying. I knew there was a lot to sort of unpack there going into it.
yeah,
But coming out of that experience in my 20s, I definitely felt like a failure. And then was able to sort of look at it through the lens that you're sort of speaking to, and pull out some really important things from it.
I'm smiling here because I was at a retreat in Colombia, in at the beginning of June as part of this psychedelic therapy training that I'm doing. And one of our teachers, Leela, who is this incredibly powerful, experienced, I mean, I was going to call him a shaman straight up. He wouldn't call him that himself, but he was giving us instructions ahead of a ceremony where he was just encouraging everybody to be open to what is actually happening and don't judge, and work to set aside your expectations and preconceived ideas, and because whatever's happening is what you need to see. Whatever's happening is what is happening, but you can if you judge what's happening, or you judge yourself in the process, you may miss some of the things that are actually coming to you. And he talked about an example where he had been in the US on a Lakota vision quest, and they had returned after these 4 days and 4 nights out on the land. And then one of the people that came in said, like, oh my God, this was such a waste. Nothing happened. I mean, I was in my circle, I was in my spot, and these dwarves, they just kept getting in the way the whole time. They were keeping me from concentrating on the vision quest. The dwarves, they were annoying me so much. so here are these magical creatures showing up. They're trying to tell him something, but he's so focused on what he thinks should happen that
Right.
that they're just annoying him. And all he wants is for them to go away. And he comes back feeling like this was a complete waste of time, and and he was unsuccessful.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I think there was another thing that that happened to me out there in terms of thinking about the perception of time, and like having patience, was a huge part, I think, of all of the discomfort that I experienced out there. I think even on the first night, not of the solo, but the first night of the 14-day field course, where you don't have a blanket, you don't have your sleeping gear, they haven't shown you where to find debris yet, and it's so dark at the point of time for bed, there's nothing you can do anyway. You can't see anything. The only thing you can do is just lay down on the ground and be cold and uncomfortable all night long. And there's something about that when you're uncomfortable like that, like time just goes by even slower. Like it's just like torturing you. Like time is just like, oh, you're uncomfortable. Here, let's just slow down time and make it even worse. And I feel like there's this thing that I've sort of come to understand now because of going through those types of discomfort, where when it's over and you're like comfortable, you're like thinking back on it, right? And you're like, wow, that was like that experience of time was like so slow, but like here I am. It's like time passed, and now I am where I am, and I'm comfortable again, right?
Yeah.
And so I think about like those experiences that I've had in the past, and like when I am uncomfortable like that, I think when I'm experiencing the discomfort and time is slowing down, I think if I just keep sitting here doing nothing, eventually this experience that is uncomfortable will have passed, right? And I think about this too, like, when I was on acid and as a teenager or something, where you're like starting to come down off of acid and you're like, oh fuck, or it feels like it's never going to end, right? Like that. You're like, okay, I'm done. I'm like peaked. And now I'm like, is this experience ever going to end? Oh my God, am I just going to be like this forever? And of course it does end. And it just requires sort of waiting it out. And I think about that a lot with discomfort, is like, this sort of sense of waiting it out, and how that experience has given me a lot more patience, and through the discomfort, to just sort of like embrace it and sit with it, and just welcome it, as opposed to try to get it away or speed up the time or any of those things. We're just like, okay, this is just going to be what it is, and I think about that.
Okay, go ahead.
I think about that with this sort of the sort of accordion of psychological experience of time, like, and thinking, like the 14-day field course, halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, I'm thinking I could easily do a 28-day course, like And then towards the end of that 14-day field course, you're thinking, God, I want to get home. I want to get out of here, right? But how much of that, not necessarily because it's a bad experience, you're just like, anytime you're sort of getting toward the end of an experience, there's sort of that cresting down of like, okay, I'm ready to go or whatever. Like you're already kind of leaving,
Yeah.
and I think about that with the experiences like this, where how much of that ready to go home feeling would have, so then I'm thinking, well, geez, could I do a 28-day course? But I think there's this level of commitment and sort of like understanding psychologically how much time something is going to take when you go into it, and having like the preconceived notion of it. So I think I could easily do a 28-day field course. I think, and I think, that towards the end of that 28-day field course, I would feel the same things that I felt at the 14-day field course, if that makes sense. It's like this psychological thing.
No, there's no question. I mean, the mind is extremely malleable, and I think managing expectations is enormous. It's an enormous factor in how we actually experience things. I spent a lot of time, working as a designer on different projects, large and small, internationally. And I think if you don't manage expectations in a project, you can do everything that is being asked of you on time and on budget. But if you haven't managed expectations, it could still be a failure, just because of how it was experienced.
Totally.
And I think, if you invite people to a 2.8-day course, but it takes 28 days, it'll be a disaster.
Right.
And almost no one is going to be able to get through it, even though they might have the skills and the gear and the time to do it. And so I think it's like, you could come prepared for a 28-day course, and you could probably do a 280-day course.
Right. Yeah.
If you could operate the accordion properly.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I think, in terms of that's sort of like going into a solo, knowing that I was going to be there for 5 or 6 days, I might have a different experience. Like it might stretch out those moments for me of like, the discomfort of being by myself. And that I could totally do that going into it, knowing how much time,
Yeah. And I wonder, I think, we live in a culture that has tried to banish discomfort. Or put differently, we live in a culture that worships comfort.
Yeah.
And I think, some people argue that is natural, like it's a human drive to try to eliminate discomfort. But I think I think we could argue that. But I think that what I understand, and I speak with some authority here, both having taught at Boss for over 10 years, but also having worked as a designer for the ultra wealthy. I've spent part of my time creating environments, asked to create very refined, very luxurious environments for very wealthy people. And so I've operated on the whole spectrum. and I think, we need discomfort in order to understand what comfort is. We need discomfort and deprivation to some extent to understand and value what we have. And I think, we have deprived ourselves of this expansion and contraction experience, which gives both energy and meaning to life, or energy and meaning to the experience of living. And so that the arbitrary, simplified worship of comfort is very, very destructive. It basically creates people that are dissatisfied and unhappy and unhealthy.
Right. Yeah.
So therein, I think, lies some of the timeless value of the Boss experience as well. It's a very, very persistent or consistent effect that I see in students over and over again, from all walks of life that come into the experience, and they come out of it just feeling enormous gratitude for what they have, enormous gratitude for the relationships they have, enormous gratitude for the material things and the comfort that they have in their life, and,
Mm.
and it rewires people permanently,
Mm.
and that's priceless, right?
Yeah,
It's totally a priceless effect.
totally.
um,
Yeah, I'm looking forward to doing the hunter-gatherer course, especially
oh
after
yeah,
doing the 14-day, kind of
you
getting
should do it.
the basic sort of, boss experience, and now kind of moving on to, what I do feel will probably push my edges way more than that course.
Yeah,
And I
the
feel
Hunt
ready.
Together is amazing.
I feel
It's
ready,
amazing.
you know.
It's my favorite course. You're
Yeah.
totally ready.
Yeah. I mean, I love the fact that they're like, well, an hunter gatherer course, it's that for, I was talking to people, other people about this, and my friend Cliff, he did the course, he did the hunter gatherer in like 1999 or something like that. And he was saying that
uh,
I had described the very first night or whatever, and he was like, so the hunter gatherer course is basically that first night, but for the whole 2 weeks or whatever, and I was like,
that's
okay,
right.
well,
Yep,
let's see
there's
what
no
happens.
blankets.
Yeah, no blankets, exactly.
Yeah, yeah, I know
And I was like,
that.
no, but you could still build a duff bed. I mean, there's lots of things, but yes, there's no blanket, right? Um, so anyway,
Yeah,
I'm
there's no
excited
knife,
to, yeah, right,
no water bottle.
all the things you have to do. I mean, and that makes me, um, I think that's the push of field tested experience that I'm interested in right now, especially after doing the basic course and kind of understanding how my body reacted to that. Now I feel like confident that I'll be able to work around my the challenges that I have physically.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I love the Hunter Gatherer. It's totally my favorite course. I've done it 3 times.
yeah.
um I love the particular colleagues that I work with there. But I think that people talk a lot about mindfulness and meditation and being in the moment and nature connection and all this stuff. There's no there's no better way. There's no more kind of original and powerful way to do it than to immerse yourself into this, um, you know, archetypal and fundamental human experience of just unmediated living off the land.
Totally.
And all of your senses, all the switchboard with all of your neural pathways and all of your senses are all like,
Mm.
you switch them all on. um, and your hearing and your sense of smell, and you're sensitized in this way, and which results in you becoming extremely present, extremely connected. And then there's this amazing, um, people talk about the bliss of
Mm.
meditation.
Mm.
It's like nosing up towards this enlightenment, right? But a lot of it resides in entering into that baseline human existence. um, and we talked about the built environment before, and human-made buildings and environments. Like, those environments ask something of you. you know Even the sidewalk, the tarmac speaks. Here's the oil that was mixed with the gravel, and the gravel came from here, and the oil came from here, and it's fundamentally toxic, and it's made to be smooth. And you can't walk further to the right because there's a curb there, and that's for cars, and that's if you do it in the wrong way, you could be arrested. On the other side of the sidewalk are these buildings which are private property, and it costs rent and private, and so it's like there's all this information that's coming at you. We look at it as being benign, but that's only because we consider it normal.
Totally.
But when you're stalking through the canyon, there's none of those narratives coming
Right.
at you. The only narratives that are there, that all of your senses are tapping into, is that is the information that you need. The direction of the wind, the temperature, where's the shade, where's the water, which animals move here, and where are they now, what are they looking for, all of that stuff. And it allows you to open yourself up completely and just take it all in. And that is, being alive. That is being present.
Mm. Totally.
And it's like everybody at some point in their life should grant themselves that experience. Change the world.
Yeah. Awesome. I feel like
So
that's
do
a
it.
good. I feel like that's a good place to end to wrap things up. Um, I promised my fellow alumni that I would give them a shout out. Um, so I feel like that's
Do it.
the last thing I want to do is just yeah, thank you to the group that I had out there. Jeremy, Parrots, Adam, Cheyenne, uh, uh, Landon, Ethan, who ended up having to head out early. Um, we had an awesome team out there, and I felt like we did really good. There wasn't very many of us; it was only half of a normal course. And I also want to shout out to the three instructors, two main folks in the apprentice, um, Matt and Heath and Barrett. It was great
Hmm.
to have them, and
Such an A team.
yeah, did feel like an A
Yeah,
team of
love
instructors.
those
It was
guys.
great. Each of them had like super good skills in different areas. They were all complementing each other in really great ways. And then yeah,
Yeah.
the way our team kind of came together and um, all of us, it was awesome to be out there with those folks. So
Hmm.
shout out to my fellow alumni and teachers.
Go boss.
And
I
thank
mean,
you,
I'm.
Hannes, for
Oh yeah,
encouraging me to go and for coming on here and chatting. There's always more.
totally. And
I feel like we could, there's a lot of questions I think we didn't even get to, so I feel like we could do a whole nother thing at some point. This always
yeah,
happens.
yeah.
But
No, I mean, we're moving in pretty interesting, very interesting and timely territories. So I think it's lots to talk about.
yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the
Peter,
Rewilding podcast.
totally, Peter. Thank you so much. And I love, how do you say, we need rewilding a lot.
Yeah,
And so thanks for having me and thanks for the good work and
for
keep it
sure.
up.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to the Rewilding podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guests and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe and support my work by becoming a patron of the Rewilding podcast at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. And as always, you can help by writing a review on Apple Podcasts and make sure to share on social media. Thank you for listening. Until next time.